greetings to everyone who's watching the Red Pill Diaries. We have our esteemed guest, historian, and I would say geopolitical analyst and journalist, Tarik Amar. How's it going today, Tarik?
I'm fine. How are you, Rashid?
I'm doing pretty good. I just realized before we start talking, I realized that it may have been the inclement weather that we're going through where I'm at, and that's why I told you it would be better for you to go out
Oh,
and then come back in. So
sure.
it wasn't anything on your end. It's pretty much on my end. Um,
No problem.
but let's go right into it, Tariq. What do you have to say about? Because I know the whole world is watching this circus over here in this political season in America. What what are the people that you know saying about the recent happenings with Trump, the assassination attempt, and what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the assassination attempt in Butler, right, in that small town, I think from what I read, it's similar in the United States. People have been shocked and they have been, to an extent, also confused because, on one side, of course, the attempt to kill him in and of itself is a major event with potentially frightening implications.
Hmm.
But on the other hand, there is a lot of astonishment at the way this has unfolded, at the way that his protection, his security detail, his Secret Service detail seems to have acted with really great incompetence, right?
Right.
At the way that this 20-year-old loner, could manage to get so close. I mean, in European metric terms, we read 120, 150 meters. Everybody understands that that's a very, very short distance. And of course, we also see that, and we hear and we read that the shooter had basically a clear line of sight, right, on the former president and the presidential candidate standing on this raised stage. And then there's the information trickling out. You see the same thing, I'm sure, about the way in which his security responded after the attack had happened, in which they were sort of, for a moment at least, confused, didn't know what to do. Look, I mean, my sense is that people in the whole world are going to wonder how much incompetence you can have before it looks deliberate, right? This seems to be the question here. I personally, and this is really just my personal guess because I don't have any privileged information. I personally still think it's a competence, but I can see, and this is, I think, much more important, how a lot of smart people who are not in any way more stupid or less informed than I am would tilt the other way and would say, no, this is no longer plausible. There's something more here, right?
Mm.
And this is an effect, I think, that I guess, obviously, I don't know everybody in the world, right? But I think this effect is very widespread now, inside and outside the United States.
Do you believe, and do the people that you know that you talk to believe that this is a symptom of imperial overstretch and imperial decline?
You know, if you think about it's hard to say, and I tell you why. Because obviously there have been attempts and unfortunately also successful attempts at political assassination in the United States before. Right? Not only in the United States, right now we're talking about the United States. And so not all of them happen in circumstances that are similar to what is going on now. But let me put it like this to you. When this happened, one of my first reactions was, after I'd sort of recovered from the shock, right, with the new information, one of my first reactions was, well, I don't like Trump, but I am relieved this didn't work. And the reason why I'm relieved it didn't work, I mean, first of all, I don't like murder, but also the reason is that I had a very strong feeling that if it had, in quotation marks, worked, and if he had been killed, I think there would have been a great wave of instability in the United States, including riots, including armed riots, including vengeance attacks, including perhaps even a slide into like local secessionism up to civil war, to be honest. And if you ask me about is this somehow connected to the way that the United States, in my view, is undergoing very severe decline, in the sense that it could have triggered these horrific outcomes, I think it is connected. The United States is an unstable society, in my view,
Yes,
that
it
could
is.
be toppled over into something much worse by a shock like this. And that's only possible if something is deeply wrong in the first place, right?
Hmm. Well, what are the Europeans? Because we know that there was a recent NATO NATO meeting. What
So it's good.
that's why. But this little circus or whatever. What are they saying about Joe Biden's cognitive decline and being so-called the leader of the quote-unquote free world? His quick cognitive decline. Are they worried? Are they now starting to reconsider their aggressive policies towards Russia?
I bet with you that they're extremely worried, but they're still trying to lie about it.
Hmm.
Right? So
Hmm.
the Europeans who are in the European Union and who are in NATO, right, who are basically clients of the United States very much, right? I don't like Trump and I don't like JD Vance either. But Vance has a point when he implies that the Europeans are clients, because he said that to them at one point. He said, we don't want clients, we want allies. And what he means by that is we want people who pay for themselves. So he comes from a very specific angle, but I get his point, right? But he's correct factually in that the Europeans are clients. And in fact, I would follow the former finance minister of Greece, Yanis Varoufakis, who was even more clear, and he said they are vassals. They really are vassals, right? And so they have behaved very much like the mainstream media in the United States, or like sort of the centrists in the United States, or like the Democratic Party establishment, in that I'm sure some of them have known it as well as I do and as you do for a long time, but they've all kept silent. And so we had the same effect, I think, as in the United States. It was only after this catastrophic debate, when they couldn't suppress it anymore, that they even had to acknowledge it, right? But they're still very reticent to talk about it openly, extremely reticent, maybe even more than in the United States, because they're more afraid. And concerning revising the policy toward Russia, I don't see it happening yet. The one person, well, there's more than one, but there are not many. But the one person who stands out arguing for this inside the European Union and also inside NATO in Europe is the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, right? Who is a friend of Trump, who's very far to the right. You see, I mean, recently I'm in this horrific situation. Like, I'm on the left, I'm basically a socialist, and I have to agree with all these right wingers about different things, at least when it comes to security. And Orban is the one major prominent European figure who has gone out of his way to say we really need to change our policy. We need to stop literally following the United States. He says the United States, in terms of the war in Ukraine, only has a policy of war, and we have copied that policy. And we finally need to develop our own policy here in Europe, which would be aimed at finding peace. But he's still an exception. He's treated as an outcast. He doesn't care. He's used to that. It's okay for him. But he's definitely not the mainstream of the Europeans, not yet. So I really don't know what will happen in Europe if Trump wins in November, as seems likely, nobody knows, but it looks like he might very well do that. And if he really goes through with his plan to force the Ukrainians, in essence, to make peace. And then he would obviously also rebuild the relationship with Russia on the side of the United States. And the Europeans, who were such obedient followers of the former administration, of the Biden administration, you know what? They will be left out in the cold. And Orban seems to be the only guy in Europe who sees that coming.
Mhm. Well, I I don't put much stock in any president changing U.S. policy. I think it's a continuation policy because if you look at what Trump did in his term, he was the one
Yes.
who sent the arms. Obama started it. Trump doubled down and sent the arms to Ukraine and funded the training for these same mercenaries. And then Joe Biden doubled and tripled down on what Trump did. So, and I don't believe that the deep state would allow for a drastic change in U.S. Domestic or foreign policy because in their minds, I believe that they believe that America has the inherent right to dominate everybody and everything. And the only way that you see it look like a pause or look like a change in policy is when they want to pause and focus on something else and double back to what they did after they moved to that other thing. And that other thing I'm talking about is China. Um, what is your thoughts on that? Because a lot of people they're putting a lot of stock in Trump. And remember, you can judge a person by the track record that they have, and all one has to
Mhm.
do is look at the first term. He was the one who initiated the devastating sanctions that blew back on America, that he tried to put impose upon China. He was the one that started the tech war. I see. I'm apolitical. I'm not for Trump. I'm not against him. I'm not. I don't like Biden at all. But anyway, um, um, how will people expect such a drastic change in policy when the track record says that they only continue the policy made by the so-called deep state?
Yeah, look, in general, I agree with you. There is an enormous amount of continuity. But I would ask the question, what shape does the continuity take at any given moment? And what exactly do they continue, right? And as you said, um, there can be at least a momentary change when they want to focus their continuous aggression somewhere else, right? So that's
Mhm.
point number one. And I totally agree with you. The Trumpists want to focus on China. They think it's much more important than Russia. They're obsessed with China. And I guess that the idea to turn one's back on Europe to an extent and to sacrifice Ukraine is genuine with them. Not because they're
Mhm.
humanists, not at all, but
Yeah.
because, especially by now, since the war has lasted more than 2 years in Ukraine, they look back at this and they say it's a bad investment. And if you look at the way they talk about it, this is how they talk about it, that it's always about the money and about not producing a result, right?
Mhm.
So let me put it like this. I think if Trump came into office again, and the war would go really well and he would see a chance of coming out the winner quickly, he would probably go for that. But I think the opposite is the case. He has made up his mind that this particular business in Ukraine is not making profit. That's basically the logic. And so
Mhm.
that's why he's ready to essentially dump the Ukrainians, right? And so the question in the end is, what will this mean for Europe and for the Ukrainians? I personally think, no matter where he's coming from, making peace is better for them,
Mhm.
even if many of them won't agree. I understand that. They see it differently. But I think the killing has to stop, right? Now, don't get me wrong. I don't think that Trump will in any way be um, a relief in general or a good president. Frankly, I think we will look at some terrible things happening in Asia. I think this China obsession might get very dangerous. And the other thing is the Middle East. I mean, Trump and Vance both, and so many Republicans under and behind them are completely in alliance with Israel. I mean, as bad as Biden. And so I don't want to say it's going to be even worse because I very much respect people who speak for the Palestinians, like Ali Abu Nima, and who
Mhm.
rightly say, look, it's a genocide already, right? So please don't tell us it's going to get worse. This is the worst already happening. But let me put it like this. With Trump and people like Vance, who is like a hyper Christian Zionist of the worst sort, I don't see any chance of it getting better in the Middle East concerning Palestine, concerning Israel. And then also they have a huge obsession with Iran. And
Mhm.
there's still this possibility that they might finally do what the Israelis have wanted the United States to do for a long time, namely attack Iran the way that the United States in the early 2000s attacked Iraq for them, right? So don't get me wrong, I have everything in US politics, and I don't mean this in a demeaning or offensive sense. I mean it strictly as a political analysis. But everything in US politics, in my view, is really hopeless, frankly. I have to say one thing. If you ask me personally, I would never vote for Biden. Never, under no circumstances. And the reason is, I mean, I wouldn't for many reasons, but the decisive reason is that once somebody is committing a genocide, you cannot possibly approach me with an argument about lesser evil, right? There is no lesser evil in genocide, and Biden is a genocidaire now. So it's off, it's gone, right? If I were American, I'd probably vote third party. That's what I would do. I wouldn't vote for either of these two, right?
Mhm. You brought something up, and it's amazing because I was getting ready to talk about the Middle East. Let us not forget, excuse me, that it was Trump that said that he would recognize East Jerusalem, I mean West Jerusalem, as Israelis. It was Trump that unilaterally ignored international law and recognized the Golan Heights as part of Israel. And
Yes.
it was Trump that bombed Syria on false chemical weapons charge, just like Obama did. And they do have this obsession with Iran. And what I'm saying is, Israel is literally financially bankrupt. It is in a political tailspin right now. They're losing on the battlefield against Hamas. The Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu is facing corruption charges that may put he and his wife away. Um, and then they are upping the ante with Hezbollah. Do you, when you said earlier that it's about the money, remember that Trump kept talking about pulling out of Syria but never did, and we got all kind of explanations of why he never did. But we know that the oil is being stolen, the wheat is being stolen,
Yeah.
the corn, the gas, all of that is being stolen and sold for pennies on the dollar to Israel or whatever, or given to Israel. How could you expect a different policy, a Middle East policy that will lower the temperature, especially while they are bombing innocent children and women in Palestine, while America is ignoring international law, Britain is ignoring international law, NATO is ignoring international law, and Israel has the freedom to kill like she did the other day. This doesn't get talked about a lot. We talk about the assassination attempt on Trump, but the day before, so Israel gave orders to the Palestinians to
Yes.
leave to a refugee camp and then
Yes.
bombed the
Mhm.
refugee camp, killing
Mhm.
hundreds, 100 people or more, and injuring hundreds more. This didn't get talked about. How can you
Yes. Yes.
expect the temperature to be lowered under Trump? I believe, and I'm not saying that Biden would lower the temperature. I'm just saying, how can we expect a policy change when both Trump and Biden are heavy Zionists or supporters of Israel, regardless to whom or what?
I do not expect this change there. Not in Israel Palestine or Palestine under Israeli occupation and apartheid. I do not expect an American policy change if Trump comes in. I think you're absolutely right. There is great continuity there. The hold of political Zionism in the United States is incredibly strong on the Democratic and on the Republican side. I personally think that the one thing that Palestine needs to be liberated from this genocidal, mass murderous, fascistic, Zionist regime is that the United States loses its power in the Middle East. And that won't happen under Trump, not yet, but it might happen in my lifetime. I'm serious. The United States is a power in decline. And at some point, we may see a world in which the United States won't have Israel's back anymore. And I know that a lot of people think that the Israelis have their famous, totally illegal nuclear weapons, right? A complete nuclear rogue state, and that therefore they are untouchable. But I don't think that's true for two reasons. First of all, Israel is extremely small. If they use one nuclear weapon, they vanish, and they know it, right? And the other thing is, others in the Middle East will acquire nuclear weapons too. This is going to happen. And one of the first ones is probably going to be Iran. And I know a lot of people find it very strange if I say that, but I hope they do so soon. Because the Israeli monopoly in that region on nuclear weapons has to be broken. And once Israeli nuclear weapons are counterbalanced by Iranian nuclear weapons, Israel can certainly no longer use them. Then it's over. And then everything will be down to conventional forces. And if you imagine a future in which the United States does not help Israel because they can't do it anymore, Israel will definitely lose against a coalition of its neighbors. Absolutely. Look, if you look at the way they have committed this genocide now for almost 10 months, right? They're fighting a small, extremely underarmed guerrilla force. And they still couldn't do it and commit their genocide, which is the main thing they're doing, without massive, constant American deliveries. So how are these people going to fight a serious war against serious opponents who are sort of their size? They won't. Not without American aid. So my hope, I know this is fairly desperate, but my hope for Palestine is sort of long term. It is that the United States finally is forced to abandon the whole region. And then Israel will come up against enemies it won't be able to defeat. And that will be the end of that terror regime. And then Palestine can be liberated.
Well, what do you think about uh, the totality of Israel becoming so desperate? Because remember, as we discussed just a few minutes ago, they only exist or are financially solvent because of the injection or infusion of money from the United States, the UK, and Europe. With Europe and the UK going belly up with these sanctions on Russia, and the United States being taxed to the limits with her military expansion, and also weapons production. How do you think this will play in the mind of Bibi, thinking that knowing that he only has a short window to start this war with Iran?
I think I do not understand how any Israeli leadership thinks that what they're doing now has a future. So I can't explain that. But they are so deep into their own crimes. And let's not forget, these crimes started in 1947, 48 at the very latest, right? 48 was the first massive wave of ethnic cleansing, how they really created this state. And then they went on from there. And now they're adding this massive genocide, right? So they're so deep in their crimes. How can they actually find a reverse gear? I don't think they have one anymore. And in that sense, they're like a criminal who has nothing to lose. It's a state that has nothing to lose at this point. Obviously, right? The Russian foreign minister today at the UN, Lavrov, was again talking about the two-state solution. He gave a fairly critical speech about Israel and the US. That was great. But like all politicians, in the end, he says two-state solution. I think a lot of people realize that in reality, the two-state solution won't work anymore. Because imagine you're Palestinian. You cannot live next to these people. This is over. This is over. That possibility of compromise has been destroyed. And it has been destroyed in stages by the radicalism and the brutality of the Israelis. That's what has happened here. So in the end, it's going to be a one-state solution. That one state is going to be Palestine. And so that nobody misunderstands me, that doesn't mean that innocent Israelis get ethnically cleansed or murdered. Not at all. Innocent Israelis in that future, in my view, ideally, innocent ones, should be given a chance and they should be told, look, if you want to stay here and obey the new laws and be a normal citizen without privileges, there's a place for you. I do think my utopia for the future is that Palestinian state will also prosecute the many criminals and murderers among them. Because I don't think truth and reconciliation commissions will hack this one. This won't be enough. Such terrible crimes have been committed so systematically and for such a long time, there has to be real justice. And once again, I'm not talking about brutal revenge, I'm not talking about massacres, I'm talking about trials and justice, as criminals should get, right? So this may all sound very unlikely, but I think this is where this is going. What are the Israelis thinking? I think in their fanaticism and their supremacism and their arrogance, they think that they can shut all of this down by violence. For instance, there is probably an idea in that society, I know there is an idea in that society, they're very clear about it, that they can expel everybody, total ethnic cleansing, right? Get everybody out of Gaza, get everybody out of the West Bank. Now, first of all, that is, of course, another enormous crime of which they're working constantly, gradually. But first of all, it's not working, even on its own terms. They have devastated Gaza. They have committed a horrific massacre, but they have not managed to get the Palestinians out. Most of them are still there, and they will still be there when this is over. Similar for the West Bank. But now there's a hypothetical. Let's assume they could actually murder 10% and the other 90% they just push out beyond the borders. That doesn't mean anything is over. There are millions of Palestinians in refugee camps already outside the borders of Israel. And whoever they add to those who they will expel, ethnically cleanse entirely from their country, will also remember, and their families will remember, and their descendants will remember. This will never be over. You know, there is this theory that an Israeli nationalist, a Zionist, developed. You have probably heard about it in the early 20th century. And the name of the theory is the Iron Wall. And the idea was, we erect this iron wall, metaphorically speaking, and what this really meant is we are going to brutalize the Palestinians so often that in the end they will give up and submit. That's the theory of the iron wall. And what they don't understand is that if you brutalize people again and again and again, they don't give up. They only get angrier with you, and they only remember more. So this will not end the Israeli way. The question is how exactly it ends, but they're not going to get away with this. Not in the sort of medium to long term. Why they can't see this? I mean, look, why did the Nazis not see? If you attack the Soviet Union, you're gonna die. It's over. They're too big for you. No, this is what ideology does with people, right? It makes them blind. It makes them try the impossible because they are in this sort of fanatical belief that they are better than everybody else and they can bend reality. But they won't be able to do that.
Do you believe, and this is a quick question, do you believe that there will be a regional conflagration in the MENA region, the Middle East and North African region, because of the desperation of Israel?
In the future, I don't think what we're seeing now is the last conflagration. There is one now. We don't know if they will escalate this into war in Lebanon, right? That would be the next one. And if they escalate it into war against Hezbollah in Lebanon, it might very well bring in Syria. If it brings in Syria, the Russians will be in a very complicated situation. They don't want to be in this. But if this actually somehow gets officially into Syria, I mean, the Israelis assassinate people in Syria, right? Damascus consulate and so on. But what I'm now talking about is large-scale warfare. If large-scale warfare goes into Syria, then, even Russia can be involved in some way, although they really don't like to do that. So we don't know where this one is yet going. But even if this one at some point becomes or dies down again after they've committed all these horrible crimes and this genocide, it's never going to be over, because the Palestinians won't give up. The neighbors of Israel, who have been brutalized systematically for decades by Israel, won't give up. It will not end. Iran won't give up, right? Israel is basically built on the assumption that sooner or later you can achieve everything by violence against everyone around you. You can bully everybody, and they will never get back at you. Well, they will. At some point, they will.
That's the mind of the United States globally. I can bully and tell
Yes.
everybody what to do, and no consequences come back to me. And if it's fallout, it's your fault. It's never my fault.
Yeah.
But when now speaking on Turkey, because this has and I'm going to tread lightly here, but this is something that has been on my mind for a long time. I don't understand why Turkey remains in NATO when it is a second class NATO ally. How in the world can America justify sanctioning Turkey and not allowing it to acquire F-35s and then gives Israel F-35s and it's not a member of NATO, and
Mm-hmm.
sanction Turkey over certain things, but ignores all of the policies of Israel. And
Mm-hmm.
Turkey being the most powerful military in NATO, the most powerful military in NATO,
Inside Europe, yeah.
it 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 would doesn't it is the only NATO nation that was not supplied advanced air defense systems from NATO nations, and it is a part, and it is also the only Muslim nation in NATO. So I don't understand why would it stay in NATO, specifically seeing that the United States is using those destabilizing elements in the region to really balkanize and weaken in Turkey, for the sake of Europe.
Well, look, I don't know the answer to that. I'm not privileged in terms of information, right? I'm like everybody else. I read things here and there. I think the fundamentally the reason why this relationship continues with NATO, right, and in NATO, is that it still benefits the state. It still is useful. They get something out of it too. But it's a complicated balancing act. And there, as you point out, there's a lot of frustration. And it didn't only start with the F-35. It started in many ways with Cyprus. That there are other issues. It has to do with the relationship to Greece, claims in the Mediterranean islands, and so on. So it's pretty complex. But in the end, on balance, I think they find that it's worth it. We're getting something out of it. We are using them, right? And I think that's true. But the other thing is, what's really interesting about the way policy here is developing is that at the same time, they are now reaching out to these new associations, right? For instance, Erdogan was at Astana in Kazakhstan for the recent Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, which was a very important, big meeting, totally underreported in the Western media, but incredibly important, actually. And as far as the current state of affairs is that Turkey is actually talking about joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, right? And this is complex because this is the Russian position, come back and say, yeah, but you're also in NATO. And this is difficult for us, right? So how this will end, we don't know. There's also interest in BRICS on the side of Turkey. So right now, they're looking at these different organizations, multilateral organizations, while also trying to preserve, it seems, what they get in a very hard-headed way out of being a NATO member, right? Where this will go in the future, I don't know. But if you look, for instance, again at what Erdogan was saying in Washington when he was there for the NATO meeting that we also talked about at the beginning, he formulated extremely sharp criticism. I actually wrote a text about it. It's not out yet. But he formulated 3, 4, 5 points of criticism, and they were very, very direct. And they were addressed to the West in general. They were addressed very specifically to the United States. One of the issues was about the attitude towards the war in Ukraine, where he said, look, we, Turkey, actually are for absolutely privileging dialogue and bringing this to an end, negotiations, instead of like going on and on and on. The other major point, I would say there were several, but the other major point was a very, very clearly formulated dissent with policy on Israel and Palestine. Now, where does all of this lead in the near future or the far future? I don't know. But it's certainly not, let me put it like this. It's very, very clear that the relationship to NATO on the Turkish side is not simple. It's not like, hey, you do what you want, we follow you. Absolutely not. It's much more give and take. And in some areas, it's an extremely tense relationship, right? So where it will go, I don't know. But it's true. It's complicated.
Does the Turkish people have a some animosity toward the U.S. for supporting the destabilizing elements in Turkey to, like the YPK, and at the same time arming Greece and everybody with advanced weapons, but yet withholding advanced weapons from the most strategically placed NATO nation, which is Turkey. I mean, do the people feel like second-class citizens of NATO?
Look, I have to say one thing, right, before I make more comments, because I should say that despite my name, I'm not Turkish. My father was a Tunisian, so I'm not a Turkish citizen in the sense of, I can speak for what we think here. That's not true. I live here, I teach here, but I'm actually a German citizen. It's all very complicated. But your question, I can say something about your question based on a poll. There are relatively good polls about this issue, about how do people see the United States, how do they see other states. And the most recent one I found is from 2022, from I think March 2022. So it was taken just after the war in Ukraine really escalated. Remember, it was in February 2022 that the Russians came in with much bigger forces than before, right? So just after that, there was this poll, and it was really interesting. I remember this even now, I read it a while ago, because traditionally, before, several years before, when you ask the question, who is the greatest threat? What country is the greatest threat to Turkey? Over 50% of respondents would say the United States. The United States. Well, that is sort of part of an answer to your question, right? And then they would say, and then for Russia, that would be 5%. So here you have it, right? They have been a NATO member since 1952, it's true. But then you find a large proportion of the population who actually feels much more threatened by the US than by the Russians. That's a first, I'm using the term neutrally, not pejoratively, anomaly, something unexpected, right? So, and then they asked the same question 1 month after this large-scale Russian attack in Ukraine. So you would think this changes everything, right? Suddenly people think much more about Russia, right? It did change something, but it didn't change the overall picture. So they asked the same question in March 2022. Who or what country is the greatest threat, in your opinion, to Turkey? And the result was again like 50% said the US and 19% said Russia. So still much less, right? So you still have this peculiar situation that quite a lot of respondents here actually feel more threatened by the US. That I can tell you, that's a poll, and it's a fairly solid poll when it was done,
Okay. So now we were just talking about BRICS meetings, also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meetings. Why isn't it being played in the West? How serious and how important those two meetings were, because those were meetings that will shape the future of finance and politics
Yes.
as long as we can see in the foreseeable future. Why isn't that getting the coverage and being ignored by the Western media?
I, I totally agree with you. And I'm astonished, like you, I think. And I can't tell you because it should be, right? Because you're right. These are not only these meetings, you're right about the meetings. I totally agree there as well. But the underlying developments, these
Mhm.
organizations, that is the future, right? Not alone, but they're a big part of it. When you look at the data, and you've seen them too, in terms of the share of global uh, product, essentially, domestic product sounds weird when you talk about the word, like global economic product, the share of population, the share of landmass, and so on and so on. You go through this, and these are enormous organizations by now, and they're growing. They're not only big, they're constantly growing, right? And they're growing in terms of size, but also they're growing institutionally, interestingly enough. So they're becoming more and more complex. They have banks now. They have the new Bank for Development. It's attached, I think, to the BRICS.
Mhm.
They are thinking, they're not just thinking, they're actually building new financial platforms, new elements, new sort of, it's not necessarily currency. They're not that stupid. They won't make the mistake that the Europeans did, who introduced the euro without having a common financial policy, which is a catastrophe. So Putin has addressed that directly and said, no, 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 that's not what we do. And he's absolutely right. But they're going to build these sophisticated payment system. One term the Russians use for this, they use actually an English word, is the BRICS bridge system. And they're thinking that they're going to introduce that maybe next year, maybe the year afterward, but it's coming soon. They are shifting, meanwhile, their payments amongst each other in trade volumes, right? Say trade between China and Russia, 240 billions right now in dollar equivalent, but 92% of that trade is now in yuan and in ruble. They just don't use the dollar anymore,
Mhm.
right? So there are all these different ways in which they're building this alternative sort of universe, this alternative world with different rules, with different ideas, with, as they argue, much more respect for sovereignty and equality between nations, and so on and so on. These are enormously important developments. This is the world of the near future emerging very clearly. And why are we not paying attention? I have two guesses, but it's only guesses. One is a lot of people who work in the mainstream media now in the West are, as you know, extremely conformist. This must have to do with the way they make their careers, with the way they're raised, the way they're trained. They just follow the political lines of the governments, and the governments don't want to acknowledge these processes, right? And the other reason, I think, has to do with complexity and new information. Because look, you are reading up on this stuff, I'm reading up on this stuff. But if you're reading up on it, as you are, obviously, you know that to do so, you constantly have to learn new things because it's new institutions. It's not all just NATO, 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 EU, 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 G7, 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 right? That's a simpler word. You
Mhm.
look at those three and that's it, right? Now you have to learn about all of these new things. You have to pay attention, like very concretely, to something that happens in the capital of Kazakhstan. Nothing wrong with the capital of Kazakhstan, not for me, but I can guarantee you there are a lot of, I'm sorry, mental provincials who say, I'm sorry, in New York or Washington, and they can't really grasp that something really important is in a place that they didn't hear about when they were younger. You know, they have to learn. You have to learn. Everything changes because it's changing
Mhm.
fast. You have to learn fast. And so my second point is I think they're lazy, right? I think it's politics and laziness, frankly.
Well, it likens to me that ignoring the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting and the importance of it, and also the BRIC meetings, is like a patient having cancer and ignoring the cancer as if it's just going to vanish. And I believe that is the way that the U.S., the UK, and the West are dealing with the reality that there's a new sheriff in town, and they want to ignore it as much as
Mm,
possible, but they don't realize that it continues to grow and continues to build, and pretty soon it's going to overtake the so-called rules-based international order,
yeah,
and I
yeah.
believe that it is to his downfall. And I want to transit that to say, do you believe that these meetings and what they're trying to do in these meetings are one of the prime motivating forces by the US and the UK and the EU to escalate in Ukraine to try to beat down Russia militarily, to position. Now they're attacking China economically by banning it from the 5G network, and they're trying to impose sanctions on it. And they
Okay.
also just recently imposed more sanctions on Iran. Do you believe that fear, even though they want the public to ignore
Mhm.
these growing organizations, do you believe that it's fear by the leadership and the politicians and the military that are pushing the escalation against Iran, against Russia, against China?
Yes, I think that's totally true. I would add, I believe it's, as you say, it's a fear they don't want to admit. They don't want to speak about it as fear. And my guess is that they don't necessarily even admit it to themselves. But deep down, I think you're absolutely right. It's fear. And, I think part of what is happening is that in the West, we have psychologically, I don't even mean politically, I mean psychologically, extremely conservative elites now. And that has nothing to do, in fact, with classical political categories. So I give you an example. I think you can call Biden a Democrat, whatever, I think psychologically he's exactly that. He's incredibly conservative. And so are his followers. They want the world to stay the same. So what we've seen is, look, I think two things are ending. One is short term, and one is really long term. So the short term one is when the Soviets collapsed in the late 80s, and then the Soviet Union went away in 91, there was about 10 years, 15 years, where people in the West, especially in the United States, but also in Europe, could cherish an illusion. It was an illusion even then, but they could sort of make it work. And the illusion was that they were now ruling the world, they alone, and everybody had to follow their example, and everybody had to obey their rules. Right? Let me start with those rules. And that moment has passed already. It passed at least 10 years ago, but they're not adjusting to it. They're in denial about that one. But secondly, something else is happening, which I think is a much bigger trend. I think we are seeing the end of a Western centric world that emerged in the 15th century. I'm serious. We're seeing like a radical shift, a half century shift, right? And you could say that the end of that world of the West, Europe at first, and then the United States with Europe and even above Europe, ruling the globe, exploiting the globe, mistreating the globe, right? That world sort of peaked in the late 19th century before World War One. And then they started slaughtering each other in World War One and destroyed part of it. And then you had obviously always resistance from the rest of the world that was always there over hundreds of years, but you had ever more successful resistance, right? And by the post-World War II period, you get like the imperial system really falling apart. You get, as we know, decolonization on a massive scale. But what we are now seeing, this is more interesting even. This is another wave. We are seeing, I think, in some way, the end of post-colonial orders, or neo-colonial orders, where essentially what was replaced was the old colonial formal order by neo-colonial relationships. And if you look, for instance, at the Sahel, that's exactly what we are seeing. If you look at China, although it was never as a whole colonized, I know this, China is also a story about a country that was downtrodden in the 19th century as part of this process of this Western ascendancy, massively asserting itself, and now they're the other superpower. I think we see a massive shift in which the West would have to find its way again as a normal part of the world. And here's the problem. Western elites have trained themselves hundreds of years in feeling better than everybody else. They're psychologically deranged. I mean this
Mhm.
literally. And so they need to come off it. And they don't know how. And they're terribly afraid of that new word. They really have no idea how that's going to work for them.
Mhm. And another thing, as you said, I believe that the fear is so great because they're not going to control politics and finance globally, meaning that it's going to be you're going to have to compete on an equal playing field. And I don't think a lot of them are ready for that. They are so used to advantage that in their mind they cannot fathom the idea that we, the exceptional nation, have to compete on an equal playing field. Do you think like that plays a major part in their psyche when dealing with Russia, China, Iran, the Sahel, and Latin America?
Yes, in the sense, if you talk about psychology again, in the sense of, I think they almost feel offended, right? When countries and societies that they look down upon, on which they project their arrogance. And that's a very real thing. I mean, think of Josep Borrell, right? I mean, he has just stopped being de facto foreign minister of the European Union. And like half a year ago, he came out with it and he said, Europe is the garden, the others are the jungle. Bam. So this arrogance is very, very real, and he just let it slip. They are all like this, or most of them are still like it. It sits in their bones, right?
Hmm.
So when countries on which they look down assert themselves and resist successfully, I think for them it's actually offensive. They feel hurt by it, right? Psychologically, they're basically narcissists, they're political narcissists, right? And they can't really yet deal with this. I think it will be very, very difficult, not only for the United States, but also for Europe to finally return to normality. They are so used to being privileged. As you said, they're used to having advantages. They're used to being treated as somehow entitled to make the rules, to set the tone, and even to rule, right? And look, here, I'll give you another example. When Karim Khan, the very problematic prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, right, very difficult figure, not a fan, but when he finally issued arrest warrants, only two, far too few, against two Israeli genocide leaders, against Yoav Gallant, the Minister of Defense, and of course against Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, then he came out and he said that somebody, he never revealed the name, somebody from the Western elite had told him privately, listen, we built your court to deal with Africans. This is not supposed to be for us, like directly. They told him, right? And he felt a hero because for once he had gone against them. I don't think he's a hero because he's doing far too little, far too late. That's a different issue. But I believe him that somebody actually said that to him because that's what they really still think. They are special. The rules don't apply to them. The rules are for others. They have to be privileged. And again, they will have an extremely hard time to coming back to normality. Now, when you think about the different countries that sort of do that to them, they're also very different, right? Don't romanticize Russia. I have a lot of sympathy for the Russians, right? I'm an expert on Russia, among other things. But Russia was also an empire, under the Tsars. If the Chinese look back into their history and ask themselves, well, who oppressed us in the 19th century? Well, the Russians were there as well, actually, right? But the Russians and the Chinese have chosen not to do this very wisely right now because they really need each other and they understand alliance, which this is de facto. So Russia is an ambiguous case. But what's interesting about Russia is that the West has also never accepted them, right? So in that sense, they share a position with, say, the global South and similar powers. The West has never really accepted them. And the West has made this very, very clear again since the Ukraine crisis. It's not only that the West and Russia have been on opposite sides. That happens. It's been the way in which the West has done this, the way they've talked about them, the way they've used all these racist stereotypes, the way they've offensively underestimated them. Like, we can do this, and the Russians will collapse. It's one way of insulting somebody, right? You're so weak, you're so stupid, this is how we deal with you. None of this has worked. But the Russians have registered this all very, very well. And the Russians are also they are not a part of the West. They're a very complicated case. They're somewhere in between. But right now, this is the most important part of their identity.
it even resonates. What you said resonates even deeper, because when you listen to the rhetoric that comes out of U.S. politicians, America must lead the world. America has to lead. America. This is their mantra constantly, as if nobody has the qualifications to lead, or nobody can be chosen over America to lead the world. And I know the time is short. We have about 4 or 5 minutes. I want to play what you were just saying. So it's about a 47-second clip. And this is Mr. Joseph Burrell, exactly, word for word, of what he was saying.
Yes, Europe is a garden. We have built a garden. Everything works. It's the best combination of political freedom, economic prosperity, and social cohesion that the humankind has been able to build. There's three things together. And here Bruges is maybe the good representation of beautiful things, intellectual life, well-being. The rest of the world, and you know very well, Federica, is not exactly a garden. The rest of the world, most of the rest of the world is a jungle. And the jungle could invade the garden. And the gardeners should take care of it.
How could you even have that mindset when Europe colonized the entire world?
I know.
I mean, how?
I know they've brutalized the world, I mean, and again, it speaks to what you've just said. You find this with the Europeans, you find it with the Americans. This idea that they are particularly capable of ruling the world, ordering the world, and others are not. There are two things really wrong with this. First of all, why do you think everybody else is worse than you? And second, what is your track record? I mean, come on, look at this world run by the Europeans and the Americans. How can they be proud of this? This is a basket case of a planet. I'm serious, right? So the whole thinking is so shot through with arrogance that they have lost contact with reality.
Mhm. Well, we'll leave it right there, because I know you're busy, and I want to thank you for giving me your time. I will send you the link to the show in
Yes,
about
please.
5 minutes. I'll do that in about 5 minutes. Tariq, thank you so much for blessing us with your
Thank you.
presence.
Thank you, Rashid. Always a pleasure.
All right, be blessed and be safe.
You too. Bye bye.
All right, bye bye. Everybody, we just had Tariq on. He blessed us with a wealth of information. I mean, the guy is awesome. Every and we'll have him back on. We're gonna have a slew of guests coming on the show. You guys, please like, subscribe, and share. You gotta pass the word, because you know how they're doing me, the censors, and how they're not sending out notifications, and are suppressing my numbers or whatever like that. Don't look at the numbers. We know that we're making a difference. Whenever I came out with the acronym MENA, and I was listening to a show, and I'll make this brief. I was listening to a show last night. I forget the name of it. I don't want to Syriana or something like that. And when the guy said the Middle East and North African region, or the MENA region, it just blew my mind, because that was an acronym that I came up with roughly at the beginning of the 2000s, and I've been saying it constantly over and over. So I know that we're making a difference. I know that we're making a difference, and I know that people are listening and looking. And even though um, we're being suppressed, you cannot keep down what God has ordained. I want to thank each and every one of you for joining me. Remember, channel members will have a show this week. Remember, patrons will have something out this week. I want to thank each and every one of you for joining me, for giving me your time, because that is the most precious and most valuable commodity, and it is an unrenewable resources. So I hope that by spending your time with me in this last hour, you have received an equal or greater return. I want to thank you from the depth of my soul to the bottom of my heart for giving me your time. On that note, I'll go out the same way that I always come in, with love in my heart for each and every one of you who loves truth. Know that I love you, but know that the love that I have for you will always pale in comparison to the love that God has for you. Until we next speak again, stay strong, stay true, but above all things, stay righteous. Hey, mama, your baby boy loves you more than life. Deuces, everybody. Thank you all. We're out of here. Peace.